Once upon a time, there were two little girls named Deb. One little girl grew up to be a preacher, while the other grew up to be a pagan, and they both grew up to be the very best of friends. Join the preacher and the pagan as they take a fresh look at Christianity, from the inside out and the outside in.
Welcome to The Preacher and the Pagan. I'm Deb Bodwin. I'm from the USA, and my colleague here is...
I'm Deb Suttard from Canada.
Hello, my friend.
Hey, how's it going?
Getting over the stinking summer heat over here, and heard you guys are like freezing your you-know-what's off.
I'm looking longingly at my electric blanket. Yeah, it's a little cold in Canada these days. The East End, not the West End. The West End's still blistering.
Oh my gosh. Well, you know what? It is what it is. And we just get through with air conditioning and electric blankets and everybody's happy. So
it's the Canadian pastime to actually complain about the weather. So no, we aren't happy on principle. It's just our national identity.
Okay. Well, you know what? I am not going to tell you how to be Canadian. You guys live that Canadian life. I love it. So we are talking this week about...
Yeah, the Garden of Eden and the first bit of Genesis. Yeah.
Before we get into that, from the last week, I did actually have some conversations with my wife, who is a bona fide witch, a true blood pagan over here, and I'm sort of a scrapbook witch or pagan myself. So I just wanted to make just a quick comment about paganism. There's about a zillion ways to be a pagan. It's a very individualistic faith. You can be part of a tradition. You can be an eclectic, as I am. You can be self-taught. You can be taught by others. It's very important for me to make very clear that I do not in any way represent or speak for all pagans, because nobody can do that. We are a diverse group. We are a very fiercely independent group. And I just wanted to be really upfront to any of the pagans and the non-pagans who are listening to this podcast that I am speaking from my own personal experience, my own studies, my own my own spiritual experiences when we talk about this. I do try to do some research, so I'm not completely ignorant. But I just wanted to put that out there at the beginning.
Yeah, and I think that's really important, because when we're talking about interfaith dialogue, it's often pictured as the expert in one and the expert in the other get together and talk about really esoteric things. But it's not. It's everyday conversations like you and I are having from the place where we have kind of arrived at in our faith development.
You don't speak for all Christians. I don't speak for all pagans. We speak for ourselves. We hope you people are listening to us and you're coming to your own conclusions with maybe a little bit more education to help you come to more.
Just move to a different place along the journey, really.
Yeah.
And I mean, I come with not only my place as a worship leader, but also as an academic. So there's a lot of conversations that I have as an academic that I'm not going to have necessarily as a worship leader, and vice versa. So I'm hoping to bring both of that into our continued conversations. Okay. And that's kind of where we start as we look towards creation stories and all the other stories in the first bit of Genesis, right?
Mm-hmm. Okay. So speaking of creation stories, the Garden of Eden.
Yeah. And everybody goes there, interestingly, when we look at the opening of Genesis, there's two creation stories. Because one of the things a lot of people don't realize from Genesis is that it is a combination of 4 different periods of writing, all thrown together with no real editing going on. And we've got the Garden of Eden and the 7 days of creation stories that are 2 separate stories right there, bango, first and second in Genesis.
Like theological fan fiction, no editors, and everybody has an opinion.
Yeah, exactly. And one of the cool things about the two stories, I mean, creation story itself, is that with people who were pre-scientific, who had no sense of the history that we now know and can take for granted, thank you to the scientists, it follows along relatively the way we know that evolution happened. I think that's kind of cool. They didn't, I mean, they weren't observing it, creation, obviously, because it happened long before human civilization, but that they understood something in the process is kind of neat.
Isn't it just the idea that people can take things like the 7-day creation and literally think they are literal and not metaphorical? It just blows my mind. But you were saying something earlier about 11 books, because I want to just get right to that before we start on anything, because this is the first time hearing of this 11 books thing.
Okay, 11 chapters, actually.
11 chapters, so thank you.
If you open Genesis and you go from chapter 1 to chapter 11 with the Tower of Babel, that's the period that I refer to as Judeo-Christian mythology. And I'm not alone in that. Others mention that too. And I'm using mythology here in the anthropological way, not the common cultural way of myth being a lie. That's not it at all. But myth as stories that we tell each other to make sense of the world.
Okay.
And I think the best way to read these 11 chapters, quite honestly, is on a starry night. You're sitting around a campfire and someone says, you know, Grandma, Grandpa, where do we all come from? Why are people different? Why do we talk in different languages? Why do animals look so different? So these are all the questions that the Judeo-Christian mythology is answering in the first 11 chapters. And when you look at it through that lens, it's just a really fantastic insight onto pre-scientific imagination. And it opens up a whole world of people being in awe of the creator. And we go from there. So the literal reading of it, it just guts it from all its majesty and all its wonder and all its awesomeness. Really, someone's going to look at a watch or a calendar and say, oh, in 7 days' time, this is going to happen. How boring is that?
Yeah, a lot of, and you were talking about was it the Renaissance the last time, about how when we went to everything being empirical, being so empirical, that we lost a lot as a culture. And because I don't have an empirical bone in my body, I'm okay with it. You know, let's talk in metaphor for the rest of our lives.
Well, and that's what this is. It's a form of metaphor and it's a form of imagination. And really, most of the Bible it's not meant to be read literally. And those who do that are really gypping themselves of some really fantastic messages that go in. But let's dive into the Garden of Eden, because that's a really hot spot, especially with folks in the queer community.
You think? I want to know where Steve was this whole time.
Right? Oh my gosh. You know, one of the other things that drives me crazy about this conversation is the arrogance of English.
Okay.
Assuming that the Bible is written for English speakers. No, wasn't even written for Latin speakers or Greek speakers. This is written in Hebrew, people. Old form of Hebrew at that. There's no Steve. In fact, Adam itself, it's not even a name. Adam, it means earth creature.
I did not know that.
Yeah, Eve isn't a name either. It means mother of life or source of life.
Oh, you mean like the mother goddess?
Pretty much. Yeah. I mean, that can certainly be interpreted. And I know that there was some Jewish feminist scholars working on some really, really early versions of this stuff that did have a goddess line who was co-equivalent to God. And I don't know where that conversation is, but that's a question that Jewish scholars are looking at. Ashira, maybe? I'm not sure exactly. I haven't read too much about it. But this notion that there is female-male pairing in the Godhead, which kind of comes down to Christianity through the Holy Spirit, but the sense that God is so large and so spectacular that all gender identities can be absorbed into God. God is not a single gender entity.
That is how I've always experienced it.
Yeah.
So basically, here's the thing. Okay. Adam and Eve, not Steve, Lilith doesn't come in until many, many years later when some Jewish poet decides that she's going to be the bad guy.
Yeah,
Adam and
that's like
Eve.
15th century,
50s.
Middle Ages. Yeah. I mean,
Yeah.
it's not part of the early stuff at all.
Pagans worship Lilith as a goddess, and they're just kind of looking at the whole. Yeah, she was Adam's first. She was Eve's first wife. That could be an interesting interpretation.
That could be.
She's, as far as I am concerned, in my understanding of pagan, she is a goddess in her own right, and she has her own energy and her own respect that she demands. And the ancient Jews and the Christians, they got it all wrong, and I don't even worry about that.
Yeah, you know what? She wasn't even part of the original. I mean, it got shunted in maybe 600 years ago. It's not even part of the original Hebrew text.
Yeah.
I don't know why people want to insert things, but it doesn't belong there.
Okay, so let's talk Adam, Eve, the garden, and the freaking apple and the steak, which is probably a pomegranate, right?
Possibly, yeah. Apples are a North American fruit. They're not a Middle Eastern fruit.
Well, she is.
Well, see, this is the problem when you have a bunch of white Westerners, primarily male, interpreting these things. They keep putting themselves into the picture. It's like, no, get out. That is not where the Fertile Crescent, you know, the part of the Mediterranean where these stories are being written and taking place, don't have any white people, don't have apples, don't have a whole lot of things in it. So let's just get that out of the way. Okay. When we look at the Garden of Eden, it's a fantastic metaphor. I mean, when I talk about the Garden of Eden, I ask folks to look at what is the question for which the Garden of Eden story would be written. And the question is sort of, why is life hard? Why do women struggle in childbirth? Why do we not have God living with us? I mean, there's a number of questions we can come up with that to figure out what the Garden of Eden story is trying to answer. But these are all real lived questions that people ask. Like a woman in labor will tell you anytime, like, why does this hurt so much? Well, you know, we got a story for you that explains it. But it is not a historical experience where humans were so bad that they were literally punished and given these horrible things to deal with. These things were part of life, and they made the story to make it make sense. It's a different perspective in how you approach it. That's the mythology part.
So here's my question on this, and this is something I've always wondered. The woman is always the dupe. She's always the one who makes the bad choice. She's always, well, I could say that about most women who date men, but they made a bad choice. You know, I know if you could be gay, you would be, but sorry. Oh, we're gonna get letters for that. At least in earlier versions. Now, is the woman being solely to blame, and, you know, poor Adam just goes along because he's, you know, on her leash? Is that from the beginning, or is that something that, you know, got added in as translations happened?
We've lost the earliest versions of this, so there's no way we can really answer that question. But if you look at it, the woman is the curious one. The woman is the one who takes the initiative and finds something new. I always go, when I buy books, I always look to see how they treat three characters, Rebecca, Eve, and Mary Magdalene. And that really quickly tells me whether this is an author I want to spend time with. If we're only ever looking at a really superficial one-dimensional read of Eve, we miss so much of the story, that she, out of her curiosity, goes to investigate something that is something she wants to be part of. I mean, the snake, they put on all sorts of meanings on the snake, but the whole concept of this woman going to touch fruit of the tree that's right in the middle of everything that will make them godlike. Like, who is not curious about that? It does not make that a failure of hers. It just makes her want more.
And here is a big question that I think pretty much every woman, and possibly quite a few men who have been raised in the Christian tradition, have asked. What kind of jerk move is it to put these two innocent people in the middle of paradise, put this awesome tree with all this dangerous stuff right in the middle, and tell them, whatever you do, don't touch this awesome tree that's right in the middle? And then when they do, because you're setting them up to fail, boom, you're out in the dirt. That's such a jerk move. That does not sound like any kind of God I'd want to hang with, you know?
Exactly. It's like the German fairy tales, like Hansel and Gretel, where they're told to not go far from home, or the Peter and the Wolf, where they're told that in the forest will be danger. This is all story to explain why life is the way it is. This is not a narrative from beginning to end about this is our family history. And that, I think, is the big misunderstanding that a lot of people bring to the text, that somehow it's a chronological story, that this has all been captured and narrated as it happened. No, these are stories that were made up to explain why things were there. There's no Garden of Eden. There's no tree of wisdom and life. There's no magical, wonderful place physically on earth that humanity was kicked out of. This is pre-scientific imagination trying to make sense of their world. And when we as 21st century Westerners put literal interpretation on the imaginations of people 6 and 7 and 8,000 years ago, we do them a real disservice. They would probably look at us and laugh like, what the heck are you talking about?
You really? Yeah.
This is a story that we tell to understand how we became created. I mean, and it's not even literally logical, because in a couple more chapters, Adam and Eve have kids and they go to marry someone. Like, hello? If you're the only people on earth, who are your kids marrying?
That really? Is a whole different type of soap opera, my friend.
Right? Right? If you do this literally, you're screwed from the beginning. There is no way you can read this and actually get a sense of God's involvement in your life or the relationship we have with God, because you're going to get stuck on the details that were obviously not thought out. I mean, that's what I mean. Like, these things were thrown together, poorly edited. There's no continuity expert in this at all. It's just how people started to understand their relationship with God. And the profoundness of this is that when these stories were being told and written down for the first time, these people were under siege, and they were sieging on the Canaanites. And these are the stories that justified their sense of superiority. So they didn't worry about the details, but where the other people came from. They were just convinced of these stories that made them special to God. And when you are a people who are essentially homeless and without authority over your own territory or over your own person, being important to God is pretty powerful way to bring a culture together.
You talking about editor, and all I'm thinking of is some poor 10th century monk with a highlighter and a red pen going, what? Wait, no, I can't make this work, people.
And that didn't even happen in the 10th century. No, we have moving further into Exodus and Deuteronomy. I didn't count, but a friend of mine in seminary once said, Moses goes up the hill 4 times more often than he comes down. These little inconsistencies are because people were shoving stories together. They were not really concerned with the overarching narrative. They were just getting out their understanding as fast as they possibly could. And there might have been parts of scrolls lost throughout history as well. So we just shoved all together as things go. But if you cannot read this like you read a history book, it won't fit.
Are you familiar with NaNoWriMo, which is the National Novel Writing Month?
Yes, I am.
Have you ever read a completed one that hasn't been edited?
I haven't read any of them, I don't think. I'm just familiar with it, know it exists.
Trust me, it's the Bible. You just slap words on the paper, get your ideas out. You don't edit, you don't revise while you're doing it. And usually what you come up with is a hot mess of mishmashed great ideas, wonderful passages, and literally no through line or continuity. You've got to do a lot of editing. So I totally get that. But
yeah, and to get to really nerd out on you, there are diagrams out there. You can find them on Google. Just Google force source theory and you'll find it. And there are diagrams with color coordinated which part of the first 5 books of the Bible. In Greek, it was called the Pentateuch. Hebrews and Jews called the Torah. Genesis through Deuteronomy, outlining which part of the Bible followed the priestly writing thread. So these were the guys that were in exile in Babylon. Which are the ones that followed the Deuteronomist thread? These are the folks who were conquered by the Syrians and managed to escape that exile. Which were the team thread? So that's the thread where it talks about God as plural. And which is the Yahwist thread, which I believe is where the Garden of Eden story is included. So even the stories in the first 11 chapters don't all come from the same place.
Girl, I'm giving you your nerd cookie.
Yeah.
You win.
I mean, it is absolutely fantastic from a historian's perspective how these different threads go together. And the truly geek books, there's a few out there that do take this thread and just follow the thread. They don't mesh it together with all the rest. So you can actually see how these writings develop. And this is how we as scholars can look at this and say, okay, you know what? Something was going on here at this time. These were the outside influences that were helping the writer write this. But they certainly weren't concerned, like the Deuteronomists weren't concerned about the priestly writers. I mean, at first reason is because they weren't even writing at the same time. But they were not paying attention because all these things brought together after what was going on to create this image of the people of God. And the people of God, if you really believe that God has chosen you special, then God made you special. So you're going to have myths of origin stories to explain why God has a special relationship with you.
Okay.
And that's how you have to approach the first 11 chapters of Genesis, and not literally, not get stuck up on whether Eve or Steve. Or anything foolish like that. You've got to recognize that these are people trying to explain why they're here and why they have the relationship with God that they do.
So this is something that I was thinking on, because one of the things I did to prepare for this episode, yes, I actually do prepare for these episodes, was I was trying to find a pagan equivalent, just even one. Obviously, we're going to get a lot from the Greeks, and I was so stuck on Lilith that I didn't really think about what the message was. But I would think that the one myth that is so matches the Garden of Eden so much is actually the Pandora myth. And everybody thinks Pandora was the bad guy, but as far as I'm concerned, she was the one who saved hope. That box was there. That box was gonna be opened, whether by her or somebody else, but she managed to save hope. Kat and I were talking about this, and why do people see these things, the Pandora story, the Garden of Eden story, as a bad thing? Who would want to go back to being ignorant and dependent? I mean,
that's just the thing, that the underbelly of the conversation that people don't want to realize is that by having this knowledge, by having this wisdom, we do attain godlike status insofar as we are now able to influence our own development and take care of who we are. We also have all the responsibilities of our bad choices.
Well, and also the responsibilities of our good choices. That's, if you're going to see God or the gods as a paternal influence, isn't one of the jobs of a parent to allow their children to move forward, to not keep them always in an infantile state, to let them go out and make mistakes and have challenges, because that is, what's the point of being on this planet if you're not going to go out and live your life?
And that's exactly it. I mean, you have a perspective of being married to Kat and what you bring into the relationship. As a parent, letting their children go into the world, that's the state that I'm in my private life, where my kids are now growing and emerging and making choices that I wouldn't necessarily make for them, but have to respect the fact that that's up to them to do. And if we're really going to play on the metaphor of God as parent, then we have to follow through. We can't just cherry pick that or see that as someone who wants to restrict the growth of children, because that always backfires. God as parent in the Christian interpretation is a God who gave us free will, who allowed us to see good and bad and make our choices, and then have to make choices in response to those choices, and then continuing on down the line. And we are assured that God is with us when we need help, when we need advice, when we need wisdom. God is there, just like an earthly parent, but God does not get in the way of those choices. And that's another approach that you've got to bring to the Garden of Eden story, is that if God had left the people in the garden, we'd never be here. There'd be no us. There'd be nothing. We wouldn't be having these conversations, because there would never have been growth and discovery. I don't want to be in the garden, quite honestly.
I have this image of the godly realm, and all the gods are hanging out, and one of them goes to the Christian God, and he looks down and says, "Gee whiz, 130,000 years, and neither one of them has eaten that damn apple yet? What are you gonna do? Come on, send in a snake or something."
Yeah, right.
They're never going to catch up. It's like you are not this coddling parent who's going to keep their children infants forever. No. And it's not such a bad thing. I mean, yeah, part of me wishes I had my mom paying all my bills and, you know, my dad driving me around and all that. I wish that sometimes, but most of the time I'm really, really happy I ate out of that apple and I took that step out of the garden. Yeah. I would never want to go back to that period where I was dependent and ignorant.
Well, and that's just the thing. And that's why I tell people they've got to look at this from a story explaining why life happens to us, as opposed to a narrative that begins and follows along chronologically. All of this is just telling us, you know, this fantasy of where we were, this mythology. And, you know, every culture has it. Every culture. You mentioned the Greek mythology, but if you look at indigenous North American cultures, if you look indigenous African, South African, Asian cultures, every single culture in the world has creation myths, has stories explaining who we are, why we're here, and why we do what we do, and why we have the hardships we have. Every single one, because humans need to know where they came from. And that's what we have in the first 11 chapters in Genesis. The only possible exception in there, which I think is really fascinating, and I haven't done work on this for about 20 years yet since, is that the story of Noah is in the middle of this 11 chapters as well. And there is archaeological and geographical evidence that there was some type of flooding event that would influence people's imaginations. And it was wide spreading.
I was going to say, don't most ancient cultures have a version of the Noah, the flood?
Yes, but there's actually physical evidence that something happened right around the time when the Hebrew people, who were a mismatch of people to begin with, they were nomads and they kind of came together as this interesting group that formed family, that something around that time happened that would have influenced their imagination. But yeah, environmental crisis does influence our storytelling. Yeah.
Well, I mean, and a lot of people don't realize, because you know, I'm the way you are with biblical nerdery. I'm kind of I will watch any kind of scientific documentary you can put in front of me, especially if it has to do with old things. And climate crises have happened very periodically, usually when nobody was around to see it except the rocks. A lot of people don't even realize that less than 100 years ago, or just around 100 years ago in the 1800s, it never stopped snowing in New York all through the summer. They had what they called the Little Ice Age. People were skating on the Thames in the middle of the summer. So these things happen, and they happen in our collective memory. Yeah. There's no reason why in 1,000 years people couldn't talk about the summer that froze, you know, just like they talk about the Great Flood. Yeah. You know, growing up in hurricane country, we still hear, you know, I grew up hearing about Hurricane Betsy, you know, that part becomes part of the culture.
Precisely. Yeah, we've got, I never experienced a blizzard where you had to walk out the top door, but you can see buildings in Newfoundland and throughout the Maritimes and northern parts of Quebec and Ontario where there are two doors, one on the main floor and one on the upstairs, and they don't have a balcony around the upstairs one. That was the winter door to go out when the blizzard snowed you in to the point where the snow was up half the height of your house.
Okay, this is a bit of Canadiana that has freaked my mind out.
Yeah, but again, the environment influences how we treat each other and how we kind of grow and how our imaginations grow.
Exactly. And so we're coming back, as we always do, that the real problem seems to be the literal interpretation of the Bible.
It really is. Yeah.
Like, I mean, do you think the Greeks look at the stories of the gods and say, oh no, that literally happened? He literally turned into a swan and date raped Leto or whatever,
Yeah. No, if you read anything of the Greek time period, the story, their mythologies, their stories were to explain things that had happened and why they happened that way. And that's what we get into. See, people often forget also the Bible is a library. It is not a book. It's a library. And in it, we have mythology. There's actually legit history as far as references to what was going on outside of the Hebrew world and outside the Christian world in the book of Acts. There's a lot of novels in there. There's a lot of prophetic stuff in there. And prophetic doesn't mean predicting the future. Prophetic as in teaching what will happen to you if you keep behaving like this way. The Bible's full of all of this stuff and apocryphal writing as well, where we get all these visions of nasty and dark and horrible things happening in Revelation and the book of Daniel. And all of this is people trying to make sense of their world and to read it literally, to think everything is dictated, is to do an incredible disservice to the people who lived back then and quite frankly to ourselves, because you cannot glean wisdom from narrative if you're only looking at the surface words and not seeing what else is going on at the same time in that time period.
So you mentioned a couple of books in there. One of the questions I have, you're talking about metaphor. How much I would assume most of the Old Testament, there's very little literal reading. I don't think Moses was 700 and whatever. No. But where does that come in the New Testament? Because if you're saying that Jesus actually lived and he's told these stories, where does the metaphor end and how do you glean what is actually real and what you need out of there from the metaphor?
Well, the first place you go is the parables to look at the various teachings that Jesus had. Most of them are metaphor and parable form. For instance, the parable of the talents. That has been interpreted for some strange reason. Again, this is the English bias, as if talent is in the first century Palestinian world is the same way we use talent in the 20th century English world. It's not. So right away, anybody who uses that scripture to talk about our personal talents for music or writing or whatever else, wrong. That's off.
But a talent was a
talent was a piece of money. Exactly. Yeah. Exactly. It was a bit of money. But if you look at the story in context, if you were a first century Palestinian listening to Jesus talk about how many talents the person would have, these are exorbitantly huge amounts of money. It's like us talking about Jeff Bezos and his money. There's no conceivable way we could have that level of money. So it already, the people in the first century would have heard that and know, okay, we're talking wackadoodle stuff. Mm-hmm. We're talking way out of the realm of human reality. But we as 21st century people don't have that perspective to look at it. We just look at, someone has 10 talents. What, $10, 10,000? What's going on? 10 trillion won't even register for us. So right away, the first century folks would have heard the metaphor in that we're just talking a large sum of money that the average person could never possibly attain or pay back. So we have to work through, okay, that's a metaphor. What is the lesson we're looking here to teach? The prodigal son is another one. He gives all of half his money to his son and then brings him back in, and the son who stays is very angry. Well, these are not literal characters. They're relatable characters. Anybody could be in those positions of being the dutiful child, and the child who screwed around and spent all his money is now coming back home and is welcome with open arms. Of course, we're going to be bitter. And then Jesus talks about what we inherit is the ones who have stayed faithful and loyal, that we haven't had to go through the suffering of loss and renewal. Metaphors. It's everywhere you turn. And that was often how folks taught. They taught philosophy itself is actually, I was reading this the other day, that the study of philosophy is a study of metaphors, because metaphors relate to our experience. They don't represent our experience, they relate to our experience, so that we can find that common thread between what the person is trying to talk about and how we can understand it ourselves. There's a point in the Gospels where Jesus tells his disciples, I talk to them in parables, but I'm going to tell you the real deal. And I saw an interview about a month or two ago where someone says, oh, this must mean that Jesus isn't providing everything to everybody. And I'm like, no, it's not that Jesus isn't providing it. It's because these conversations take time. And a metaphor is so much easier to access. And a metaphor is something you can go back to. And in 10 years, you're going to hear that metaphor in another way and get a new learning out of it.
Absolutely.
But if you're going to do things straight up, you're going to have to put in the time. And most people just don't have the time or don't have the interest to do that.
Or don't even have the cognitive ability at that point. And it may not even be that, oh, you're not educated. I'm looking at all of this and thinking, well, I've already referred to myself as an inebriated tsetse fly. My brain is all over the place. I very much am what they would call in the old days a right brain person. I think in metaphor, I think in connections. But if I was somebody who had a very literal brain, if I had a very systematic way of processing information, I could see why the Bible would drive me crazy. It would be like, it makes no sense. And when you get all these people, and a lot of them are extremely scientific types who look at this and they're trying to look at it literally, I can see where some of the anger comes from. Like, this is a bunch of malarkey. This is not real. But it was never intended to be literal real.
No, it wasn't. And it's like, trying to compare Bruce Springsteen to Chopin. I mean, you can bring in Chopin's music into various parts of what Bruce Springsteen made, but if you're trying to make Bruce Springsteen into Chopin, you're going to fail. You're going to be utterly frustrated, because there are two different approaches to a musical genre.
And I'm sorry, I don't think Frederick Chopin is ever going to sing Fire.
Not at all. Not at all. And that's probably good for all of us.
And we're all happy about that.
Yeah. Now, the thing is that we have to look at the Bible for what it is and what it isn't. There's a writer I read, John Shelby Spong, I think, a while ago, and he made this absolutely brilliant observation. He said, if we look at the way the Bible is written, it is in the same way that encyclopedias are written and then dictionaries are written, with two columns of information. And we're used to that visual, meaning we're going to get information out of this. That's not how you approach the Bible. It's not a place to get that level of information like you would approach an encyclopedia to get a reference or information. Imagine if you just look at the Bible and it's straight narrative. And I've seen Bibles being written where there's writing right across the page, and it's disconcerting because you're not used to seeing that. But that's the way it should be read. It should be read as a book, not as a source of information where you can read a section of like, okay, I'm going to assimilate what this is telling me, and now I'm going to look for another bit of information, okay, and then I'll assimilate what that tells me, without the two necessarily being connected. And that's what literal reading does about the Bible, is it just assumes that you can just jump from place to place, take something, assimilate it into your reality, and go and jump someplace else without having any sense of context, any sense of continuity. And that's it. Yeah, if you do that, you're going to get very angry at the Bible, because it's not meant to work that way.
Well, I mean, if you take baking soda and sugar and eggs and leave out the flour and the heat and the mixing, you're not going to have a cake. You're just going to have a mess. Right. I mean, you've got to look at the whole, not just the individual components.
Exactly. And to take your baking metaphor just one step longer, one step further, if you take all of those elements, depending on the percentages you use, you're going to get different things too. And that's how we have to approach the Bible. Where you are in your life, you're going to get something different out of it. It's not something in your 20s, what you get out of it is going to be very different from what you get out of it in your 50s. And you have to give yourself that room to grow in wisdom in the scriptures. And that's a very biblical understanding of that. You're not going to grasp everything the first time. And quite frankly, until life has happened to you, there might be some stories in the Bible that just completely bypass you, that have absolutely nothing to do with your reality. So you can't relate to them. Suddenly life kind of hits you sideways. And now something you bypass is going to make complete sense in a different way.
It's what my friends and I refer to as the spiral path.
Yes.
And I know that there is a thing called the spiral path. I don't know if this is what that means, but it's, when you're sitting there and you're 20 or you're 30 and you're like, I keep always coming to this place. I keep losing this job, or I keep getting in this relationship, or I keep doing this. Each time you get there, you experience it differently, because each time you are further along on the outward spiral. You have had more experiences. And you're always going to go in a circle, but it's not going to be a closed circle. It's going to be a winding circle that goes round and round and gets larger and larger. And as soon as you can really just grasp this, you stop beating yourself up for a lot of things.
And we go and we take that kind of methodology, because you're right, the spiral is something we talk about in theology too. If you put that back into the scriptures, then you can look at even how these characters develop, how the Eve we have who is taking the apple, for instance, in Eden, is not the Eve we encounter by the time one of her sons kills the other son. She has evolved and she has grown, and she's now at a new level of pain, watching the death of her child that she was not at in the beginning when it was just her. We can do that with Rebecca when she was helping Jacob, and this is one of the reasons her story is something I always look to. Rebecca was talked to by God. We talk about the gods of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, but it's really, if you talk about the people who God actually spoke with, it's Abraham, Rebecca, and Jacob. And Rebecca got the message that Jacob was the one who was supposed to inherit, and he was the second son, and she had to make it right. So the person you meet when she is at the well and first agrees to marry Jacob is a very different woman from the one we meet when Jacob has to flee after he manages to get the birthright from his brother, who his brother just tossed it away, and then gets really indignant when he realizes that he tossed away something that would give him money in the long run because he didn't really care about it. So if we approach the Bible and look at it not as literal, but as character development, and we see how these people grow in their relationship with God, then it's a lot easier to read the scriptures and to see their failings and to see their mistakes and see God coming in and saying, okay, you know what? This is a bonehead move. This is going to be the consequences. And you don't necessarily see it as a punishment then. You don't see God as punishing Adam and Eve for eating the apple. You see it as a growth moment. And that's a much healthier way to look at the Garden of Eden, rather than an obsession about we're being kicked out of paradise.
Yeah, and again, it's looking at it through the obsessive getting kicked out of paradise. That's such a teenager move. It's like, I made the mistake. He set me up so bad. It's like, no, this was going to happen eventually anyway. Get over yourself. Do what you got to do. It's all good. You're never going to be 10 years old or 9 years old again.
Yes.
And you don't want to be.
No, you
don't want to be a child again. So look at us figuring out the whole Garden of Eden. I still want to know where Steve was. I'm so upset about Steve.
Yeah, well, you're gonna have to go on that journey yourself, chick friend.
And wait, so if is he even that sexist? Where's Alice? Alice and Eve.
Well, yeah, I guess you could wonder where that's all about. But
oh yeah, it's just the
most
whole
sexism is out of patriarchy, so they probably are not thinking of where Eve's getting something.
Oh my gosh, we are just like burning this up, aren't we? Okay, so I think we have pretty much covered the Garden of Eden. What do you think?
Yep. I think so. I mean, it's worth the reread from a lens of compassion as opposed to anger and resentment.
Absolutely. So I don't think we have a topic for next week. We're
Yeah,
gonna
I
have
thought
to.
we were going to go to see Mary Magdalene.
Oh yeah, we're going to see Mary
Yeah.
Magdalene. We go and see her and talk about a woman who has been maligned by history.
Oh, and still is. Yeah.
So next time, Mary Magdalene is up on
Yep.
board, and I'm looking forward to that. We want to thank all of you for joining us on this somewhat wild journey that we're taking through the Bible and other faiths.
Meandering is a word I would use.
Meandering is a good job. Okay. So I am Debbie Bodwin. I am the pagan in this situation, and you are Deb Sutter, the preacher.
Yeah.
I would like to say thank you guys. We will see you next week. And thank you, Deb, always for your time. And
Oh, I love these conversations.
Till next time, we are the preacher and the pagan.
Bye-bye.
You've been listening to The Preacher and the Pagan with Deborah Suttard and Deborah Bodwin. This podcast is a two-lady podcast production in conjunction with the Barefoot Evangelist. Our producer and sound editor is Catherine Gordon. Our theme music was composed by Deborah Bodwin. You can reach us at thepreacherandthepagan@gmail.com or by visiting our website at barefootevangelist.ca/podcast.